Hey folks, Colin Liebeck from Plastic Dog Recording. Wanted to talk to you a little bit today about drum recording and how I recorded the drums for Seal, Kiss from a Rose 2023, when we remade that song. Basically what I've done is I've opened up the session, the original session I used on my desktop. I'm going to play back a little bit at the moment. Now, this was done, of course, to match original recording made in 1992. So there were some challenges making it sound like that. The drum kit I chose, it happened to be a Yamaha custom maple kit. I used a host of different mics. We'll talk about those. And basically, it's an all-analog recording without any real plugins except things to flip fades here and there, and that was it. So as you look at the session on my desktop, you'll see when I expand it, and there just really is a complete lack of plugins except for some EQs where I flip the phase, as I mentioned. Let's go ahead and I'll play the whole track for you and get to hear how the drums sit in the track. And this is the original mix that I turned into management.
There used to be a great tower alone on the sea. You became the light on the dark side of me. Love remains a drug that's high up the pill. Did you know when it snows, my eyes become large and the light that you shine can't be seen?
You kind of get the idea. Now, a couple of the cool things I did was I did automate the reverb going into the fills, into the choruses. I did use delays. I used a couple of little tricks, but they're all outboard. Again, nothing plugged, everything's outboard. Now what I'd like to do is go into the studio, into the live room, and we'll actually look at the mics that are on each drum. There's some slight differences from the original recording that I set up for you today, but you'll get the basic gist of it. Pretty simple. I think I only used 12 mics. Here we are in my live room, and I want to go over the setup of the drums with Christopher Alice, who actually played the drums on Kiss from a Rose 2023, and did a masterful job, I might add.
Thank you.
And whenever I do drums in the studio, Chris is, if he's not doing the session, he's working with me, setting up the drums. He's incredible when it comes to getting everything right and the drum sounds I like. So let's both take you through what we've done. Chris?
On the bass drum, about 2 inches away from the batter side head, we've got one of the DPA 4055s. And just before the outside of the hole, we've got a biodynamic M88.
I'm gonna just say this about those two. I love them both. We've done a bunch of testing, Chris and I, in the studio, listening to the M88, listening to the new DPA, and you know, they're almost interchangeable. They both do something different, but they sound really good, no matter how you wish to arrange them. But go ahead, Christopher, what do we put on the outside of the drum?
On the outside of the drum, we've got the new flagship Mojave MA37 microphone, which is absolutely glorious in that particular capacity.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is I used to own two Sony C37As. Kind of my studio partner and I, he loved the Sonys, and when the MA37 was released, I brought it in and we were doing a session, and he said, well, you know, let's go with the Sony on the outside. And I was like, well, I've already set up the Mojave MA37. And I said, why don't you give it a listen? And he listened to it and he was like, whoa, it just sounds great. And the Sonys were great. They're a little darker, didn't have quite the dynamic. So on the outside of the kick drum, I really like it because it captures the full dynamic of the kick. What have we done in the rest of the kit?
So on the snare drum top, we've got one of the Mojave MAD microphones, one of the new dynamic microphones. And for Colin's drum sound, one of the things that he likes to do is he does stereo underside snare drum mics. And for that, we've got two of the Mojave MA101s. And then on the hi-hat, we've got the venerable AKG 414. On the toms, we've got the Sennheiser E904s. They're really great because it doesn't take up a lot of room, obviously. They're shock mounted and they sound really, really good.
And let me just say this, that's for the top of the drum. If I want to get a bigger sound, a longer sound, more time, huge toms, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mic on the bottom of the tom as well. I might use the MA 101, I might use the MA100s. I actually like MA100s. It's a tube version of the 101, which is a FET that we're using under the snare. But it kind of reminds me of the old KM54s without spending absurd amounts of money on vintage mics. But that combination of the E904s on the toms and the stereo mics on the bottom of the snares, it's just a really great sound together, and I really urge you to try the stereo FET. Make sure it's a FET mic on the bottom of the snare on each side, and I put them to just the right and the left of the snares. What do we do on the overheads?
Overheads, we've got the Mojave Audio MA1000s, and those are set to the cardioid pattern. Those are the variable patterns, and we just have those on cardioid, and that seems to work really, really well.
And I mentioned it before, what I like to do is I like to go through the API EQs and get that 12K. And I'll talk a little bit about the strategy of the drum kit. One of the things I learned early on was make sure you do have a strategy when you're recording a drum set. I like to start just mentally thinking about what's the worst sounding drum in the group, probably the floor tom. So it's important to get your floor tom situated in the room where it sounds good, primarily, and build the kit around it. My overheads are for capturing the high end of the kit. My kick drum mics are for catching, in combination, a nice punchy kick. My tom mics, I've gone away from the 421s. I don't get quite the dynamics I do from the E904s. And again, I mentioned you could go with a mic on the bottom as well. But there's a definite strategy to all of it. And then I have a room mic. And we didn't talk about that yet.
Not yet.
But I use various mics on the room mics. This happens to be a vintage M49, a beautiful mic to set for a room mic. So again, there is a strategy from top to bottom. Christopher Alice, he always has a strategy when recording drums. So when we come together and we do a drum project, I always feel very confident that the drums sound amazing. What did you think of the drum sounds today?
They sounded great. I mean, they're nice and full, they're rich. And, you know, I'm sure Colin talked about this. There's not an awful lot of processing that's happening. I mean, it's the sound of the mics hitting the mic pre's, and then from there you can do what you want. But the beauty of this room with Colin's experience and then the gear, you know, you're guaranteed to get a really, really great sound no matter what kind of project you're looking to do, whether it's straight ahead jazz or whether it's rock or, you know, like the Kiss from a Rose thing that Colin brought me in on. You're always going to get a really, really consistent sound. And again, a lot of that has to do with how he strategizes how to record the drums.
Well, you mentioned the gear. Let's go in the control room and look at some of that gear again and see exactly what we do once those drum sounds come through the console. Okay, let's talk about the desk first when we talk about the gear. Crucial ingredient when mixing, when recording, is the old phase meter. Now, I always tell people, if you walk into someone's studio and they're going to mix your album and they don't have a phase meter, just run away. Phase is super important. I think I mentioned it before. I'm using a Rupert Neve Design 5088, but I don't have any of their mic pre's. I have all BAE 1084s, 28s, 73s, all kinds of mic pre's, and some vintage Neve on the right side. So I like the full EQ effect of Neve EQs. I always EQ on the way in. It's essential for me. It's just part of the task. Wouldn't you agree? That just gets done.
Well, that's what I've been doing since I put my room together as well. Yeah.
And you use a lot of BAE products as well.
Yeah. I'm using primarily the 500 series 73 pre's and EQs.
Yeah, and recently I heard drum sessions you did in your studio for Christopher Lewis. They sounded amazing. And again, it's having good analog gear really gets you there if you want those types of analog sounds. But moving right along, over here in the corner is a Bricasti controller. I have 3 Bricasti reverbs, Outboard. Again, super important. I love the sound of Outboard reverb. One of the things that people like to do, which I think is really interesting and confusing, is they like to use a a bunch of different plugged reverb. And the problem with that is we're all kind of experts when it comes to listening to music. We know what music's supposed to sound like. We've been listening to records our whole lives that were done on outboard reverbs. So when you all of a sudden confuse the mind with a bunch of plugged reverb, the problem you run into when you're using something from Abbey Road and then Valhalla is you're creating different rooms and different sounds. And that does confuse the mind when people are looking for somewhat of a consistent sound. So whenever I'm listening, I'm always like, I can always pick, a lot of times I can pick out Valhalla and I can pick out other reverbs, not necessarily by brand name, but I like to make sure my reverbs are within the same culture and very consistent so it doesn't sound like the vocals in a different room from the drum kit. I think that's super important. So I always point out outboard reverbs, they're amazing. The phase meter, as I mentioned before, and the right kind of mic pre's and whatnot. And now, monitoring is a big deal. Chris, what do you use for monitors?
Well, right now, I actually am about to upgrade to better monitors. I'm using some JBLs right now, only because I have a very small space. But it's really important to have something that sounds true to what you're actually recording. So, and figuring out what the distance needs to be for your particular room as well, where you're sitting.
And that's a strategy all on its own. I use Oceanway HR 3.5s for kind of my big mains. They really let me hear playback. Customers like them, and clients, when they come in and sit on the sofa, they get a vibe of how it's going to sound in a punchy, loud environment. And then I'm always a big supporter of Amphion as well, because Amphion, when I'm tracking, I'm usually using 118s. These are the brand new. I'm very lucky to have the brand new 125As here. They're fantastic as well. But monitoring is super important. Now let's go over to the rack. Wow, I don't know where to begin with the rack. There's all kinds of fancy, happy stuff that I like to use. On the console, I do have 8 channels or 4 pairs of sidechain compression. So there's compressors over here in one rack that I pull up on that sidechain. I never really compress directly. I always pull it up on a sidechain, whether it's the Tube Techs or or the EQs, or it's the Tube Tech CL1B, or it's the 2254s, or whether it's the Spectrasonic 610s. My studio partner likes to say we have an embarrassment of riches. We kind of do when it comes to outboard gear. I love my converters. I'm drunk with happiness when it comes to having 2 Burl motherships and a Prism XR. It's really the way to go. You want to make sure your conversion is high end if you want the best sounds. I do have a Studer 24 track out there that I send music to. I send tracks to it and bring them back. I love having great conversion. And then again, awesome compressors. I don't use many compressors when I'm tracking. I use them in the mix, on the vocal, on the drums here and there, but never on the 2 bus. It's something I learned from Alan Sides. I leave my mixes really punchy and really big and open. I do not compress them. I let mastering guys take care of the compression and the limiting. That's their job. As you can see, I have a bunch of compressors. The Manley Veramue is an amazing compressor. The 2254 is the Rupert Neve Designs. Master Bus Processor. Great compressors. The Spectrasonics. Moving over, there's more meters. I never have enough meters. Metering is super important. Whether I'm looking at VU or I'm looking at LUFS, knowing where your track sits in metering when you send it out for mastering, also very important. Another reason to have a good phase meter that takes care of all your metering as well. The AMX 16s, these things are amazing. A lot of fun. They were used on a lot of recordings in the old days. This is a reissue, the RMX 16. These are reissues. They sound really good. I love all the little tricks they do. Below that, I have, the Universal Audio 1176 version C. It's a vintage one. It's amazing with a couple of, both a retro and a gate stay level. A black-faced item that's secret and real fun. It's a compressor. The Tube Tech CL1B. It doesn't get better when it comes to compressing a vocal. It puts it right out front. Sounds wonderful. Mog Audio. Wow. This is an amazing piece of gear that they created over at Mog. It's just something to look into when it comes to vocals. It's another sheen you can put on them. I have a stereo pair, which I'm very proud of. I love using them. Look into them. They're really wild. And a bunch of other goodies. My Manley Massive Passive. Wow, what a great EQ. I can go on and on about gear forever, but this is kind of what I've narrowed it down to get some really beautiful analog recordings. A couple of BAE 312s, those are fantastic. I can't say enough. Get all the analog gear you can afford and have fun with it. It's the way to go. Now I'm pulling up the snare. I got 3 mics on the snare. This is an interesting way to go about it because most people do a top mic, a bottom mic. I do a top mic and stereo MA101 FETs. Very interesting approach to the bottom of the mic. Now the reverb I'm using today is definitely a plate. It's a EMT plate 140. It's behind the wall. It gives it a really rich, amazing sound. Okay, now people always ask, do I EQ on the way in? Yes, I definitely EQ on the way in. So I'm using BAE/Neve EQs, vintage style, 1084s and 1028s. And right now I'm picking up just the top snare. I'm going to add the bottoms. Now the outputs of the bottoms are stereo, so they go left and right and they're panned hard, left and right. Now I'm going to turn on the plate, and I'm going to go ahead and listen to the kick and the snare together with the plate. Give me kick and snare together, please. Okay, my overheads are a little hot. I'm going to pull them back a bit. And again, I have the plates engaged because I want to hear them. Really nice rich sound. Now I'm going to go to the room mic and get that one going. Let's turn the level up. And let's put 14 in mic mode. Now I'm just slightly adjusting levels to get them pretty much in the even zone. Sometimes the mic pre's are a little off. They're not exact because they are vintage style mic pre's. Now I'm just going to listen to the room mic. And the room mic in this case is an M49 vintage. Really rich sound. I'll put that in with the overheads. Now the overheads, it's a really interesting thing I've done. I learned it from Alan Sides. It's invaluable. I come in through a pair of 1084s and I go from there into a pair of vintage 550As, APIs. I push 12K. My strategy for the drum kit on the top is to get all the high end and be able to mix it right and left. Now, just the 3 mics, the room and the 2 overheads sound pretty nice together. I'm going to go ahead and look at that EQ now on the room mic and see if I want to adjust it to get a little bit more of the bottom end. Yeah, and as I adjust it, I'm liking what I'm hearing. Some of the high mids, we'll bring them in. And a little bit of 10K, just a hair. It's a little hot, so I'll roll it back a bit. And now I'm going to listen to everything I got so far together. First kick down a little bit. Okay, did it reblended the kick drums. Play the whole kit for me. Okay, let me work on the toms. So right now you're just hearing the toms through the overheads and the room mic. So I'm going to change that. Turn everything off. And the drums we're hearing now, even though everything is off, is through my sidechain. I have the whole kit going through a pair of 2254s. Okay, 7 and 8 are my toms. The mic I'm using here is an E904 Sennheiser. They're great mics. I'm going to throw a little EQ on it where I like it. Let's do both. Okay, now I've EQ'd both the rack and the floor. Now this is kind of my approach of how I did the Seal record kits from Morose 2023. It's a very analog sounding kit. I didn't do anything with plugins. It's all done with reverb, a little bit of delay, and some plugins just to flip phase. That's it. I didn't use any outside influences with plugins. So now I'm going to go ahead and record a little something, and I'm going to check all my phase, make sure. And this is something that people get wrong all the time. You want to always make sure your drums are phased correctly. And when they're not, you can hear it. Okay, let's go ahead and record a jam. We'll go on for about a minute. The drums are sounding good. How do they sound to your ears? Perfect. Okay, let's do it. Getting a really nice signal on my phase meter. It's nice and fat and wide. And that's what I want to see, especially with those snare bottoms panned left and right. Yeah, it sounded really good. I had a nice full kick. I have a nice pronounced snare. Now the thing is, I can mix this any way I want later. The bottom line is I have the files I need to get to the mix. One other thing I'd like to talk about is I did put a second send on the whole session, which is my second AMS Neve. And what it's set to, if I look over here, is nonlinear. And that's the old Phil Collins snare sound. So when I'm listening to just the nonlinear portion, what I can do is I can play it back and I'll push it up. Without it. I'll demonstrate that just on the snares. You can hear that bottom kind of girth that gets pushed in there on that nonlinear reverb. Now, I wouldn't have it that high. Just where I can barely hear it. So we have a nice natural plate, real reverb. We have the AMS too, doing the nonlinear thing on the snares. And the only other thing I'd add in would be my Moog delays. If I wanted to give it some kind of delay effect, either the kick, the snare, or the room mics. Sometimes that's really cool to pull up on the room. Let me try that. This also works on a vocal really well when I lay in these different, outboard dynamics. Let's just listen to the room mics. Well, that's a little extreme. And they're running a little fast, so I'm going to slow them down. Real light, just really light. So there you go, that's it. It's all analog except for a couple sends that go into outboard gear, plate, the RMX 16, or the AMS Neve RMX 16, and the Moog delays, which are really tough to find. I love them. I use them on a lot of different things. That slap back is always kind of cool. You can put it in and out as you like it. And that's really it for as far as balancing it on the recording console before I take it to a mix. What I just did there was I panned the reverb plates right and left on the overhead mic. On anything that's right and left, I like to pan the plate. dry. There's with reverb. And that's pretty much how I did Seal Kiss from a Rose 2023. The mic placement's a little different. We're going to go over that. But it sounds pretty good, just on an analog format.